Western Front, autumn 1944. The rain had not stopped for days. Across the soaked plains of northern France, rivers of mud swallowed boots, trucks, and even corpses. The air was a mix of diesel smoke and damp soil. Along a battered country road, a column of American Sherman tanks moved. Slowly, stubbornly, their engines humming through the downpour like a heartbeat that refused to stop. A captured German officer watched from a makeshift camp near St. Lo. His uniform was caked with dirt, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fatigue. He had seen panzers, beautiful, complex machines that demanded perfection. He had believed no tank could survive this kind of terrain, not for long. And yet here they were. Endless Shermans, still moving, still fighting, their crews covered in grime, but alive. Behind every tank, supply trucks crawled forward. Mechanics in oil-stained jackets followed, hauling spare tracks and fuel drums. To the Germans, it looked absurd, a mechanical circus of grease, mud, and determination. But the laughter faded as the realization set in. The Americans weren't stopping. This was not elegance. It was endurance. And endurance, that day, was winning the war. The arrogance of steel. In the early years of World War II, German confidence was absolute. Their armored divisions, the Panzerwaffe, were the embodiment of modern war. Sleek, powerful, meticulously engineered machines like the Panzer IV, Panther, and Tiger I became the face of blitzkrieg. Each was built not only for destruction, but for prestige. Heavy, precise, a symbol of industrial perfection. To the German command, tanks were instruments of art, not tools of mass production. Every weld line was measured, every bearing machined with obsession. The result was power and terror on the battlefield, but also fragility. These tanks required maintenance crews as skilled as surgeons, spare parts as rare as gold, and fuel supplies that were constantly running dry. Across the Atlantic, America was still waking up to war. In 1940, the U.S. Army had fewer than 500 tanks, many of them light, outdated designs. But what the Americans lacked in experience, they compensated for in something far more dangerous to their enemies: industrial might. The country that had built cars for every street in the 1920s was about to turn its assembly lines toward war. The decision to mass-produce the M4 Sherman was not born from arrogance. It came from practicality. The Sherman was designed for one purpose: reliability. It was not the heaviest, nor the most armored, nor the most beautiful, but it could be built by the thousands, shipped anywhere, and repaired in the field with the tools of a truck mechanic. By 1942, American factories had entered a rhythm the world had never seen. Detroit's automotive giants, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, converted their plants overnight. Entire towns became extensions of the war machine. Women riveted tank hulls. Railways moved columns of green steel across the continent. From raw ore to rolling tank, production time dropped to weeks. The Germans laughed. To them, the Sherman was a toy. Thin armor, weak gun, simple gearbox. A coffin for 5 men, they called it. But they misunderstood something crucial. The Americans weren't building a tank to win duels. They were building a system to win a war. Every Sherman that left the factory floor was just one piece of a living, breathing logistical organism. An army of engineers, drivers, welders, and supply officers who understood that victory didn't belong to the most powerful machine. It belonged to the one that kept moving. By the time the Allies stormed Normandy in June 1944, that philosophy had taken form. Thousands of Shermans rolled off landing craft and into France, supported by an invisible network that stretched from Omaha Beach to Detroit. It wasn't perfect. Many tanks burned, many men died, but the machine never stopped turning. And as the Allies pushed deeper into France, the weather turned. and the ground began to swallow everything made of metal. The machine. Behind the machine, by late summer of 1944, the Allied advance had broken through Normandy and was pressing eastward toward Germany. Behind every combat unit, a new kind of war unfolded. One fought not with guns, but with grease, gears, and gasoline. It was the war of supply, and it moved on wheels. The U.S. Army called it the Red Ball Express, a non-stop convoy system running day and night from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. Its vehicles carried everything the modern battlefield devoured: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, even medical supplies. At its height, nearly 6,000 trucks rolled daily. Their drivers, many of them African-American soldiers, navigating bomb-cratered roads and ceaseless rain. Every Sherman tank that advanced across Europe did so on the back of that system. When tracks broke, when transmissions jammed, when engines seized in mud, there were men waiting. Mechanics, engineers, welders, who treated a disabled tank not as a loss, but as a patient. They carried toolkits instead of rifles, yet their work was often done under fire. To keep pace with the front, the Americans created mobile repair depots, improvised workshops that followed divisions into combat zones. These were miracles of organization. Tents filled with spare engines, trailers mounted with cranes, and blacksmiths hammering out new armor plates. Everything about them reflected the American philosophy: fix it fast, move it forward. When mud clogged the tracks, they devised new tread patterns. When engines overheated, they built makeshift vents. When German 88mm shells ripped through the Sherman's thinner armor, engineers improvised with welded applique plates. Field innovation became routine. A culture of adaptation that the Germans, bound by hierarchy and rigid doctrine, could rarely match. The logistical web extended across the Channel and back to the factories of the Midwest. In the heart of England, massive depots stored parts for nearly every vehicle in the U.S. inventory. In the ports of Cherbourg and Antwerp, cranes unloaded crates labeled "spare tank components," urgent. Trains carried them inland. Trucks distributed them by the ton, and soldiers catalogued every bolt. It was bureaucracy turned into a weapon. While German armored units were crippled by lack of fuel and spare parts, the Americans were learning to turn abundance into momentum. Every soldier, every truck, every Sherman was part of a self-sustaining cycle of motion. Still, nature remained the ultimate enemy. By October 1944, as Allied forces neared the Siegfried Line, autumn rains transformed France and Belgium into a sea of sludge. Roads vanished beneath brown water, rivers overflowed, and engines drowned. The Germans believed the offensive would halt. After all, their own tanks often sank or froze in place when the terrain turned to mud. But American columns kept moving, slower, grittier, and endlessly supplied. Mechanics worked knee-deep in freezing muck, stripping engines by lantern light. Supply crews built new bridges in hours. Tank retrievers pulled broken Shermans from ditches, repaired them, and sent them back into battle within days. What the Germans saw as madness was, in truth, a masterpiece of logistics. The American war machine had learned to breathe through the mud, and in the months ahead, that endurance would be tested beyond imagination when the frozen forests of the Ardennes turned war into chaos. The anatomy of persistence. 1. The technological angle. Simplicity as strategy. The Sherman tank was not a masterpiece of engineering. It was a masterpiece of efficiency. Designed in 1941 and entering combat the next year, it prioritized reliability over raw power. Its Continental R975 radial engine, originally built for aircraft, was air-cooled, simple to maintain, and astonishingly durable. Unlike the German Maybach engines that demanded precise tuning and special fuels, The Sherman's engine could run on ordinary gasoline, even under poor conditions. Its transmission was straightforward, its suspension forgiving. The Americans favored the vertical volute spring suspension. Easy to replace, easy to clean. A broken spring could be swapped in the field without specialized equipment. Every bolt, every track link was standardized, meaning one spare part could fit any Sherman anywhere in Europe. That kind of modular thinking didn't inspire fear in German officers. They saw it as crude, almost primitive. Yet, on the battlefield, it meant the Sherman could take damage, retreat, and return to action within hours. The real genius wasn't in any single feature. It was in the philosophy of maintainability. The Sherman was built not for the engineer, but for the mechanic. And that subtle difference meant survival. The tactical angle. The tank that worked with everything German tanks fought like predators, individually powerful, but dependent on ideal conditions. American tanks fought as part of an ecosystem. The Sherman was never meant to duel a Tiger head-on. Instead, it worked alongside infantry, artillery, and, most critically, air power. In a typical engagement, a platoon of Shermans advanced with infantry in close support, using smoke shells for cover. Spotters guided P-47 Thunderbolts or Typhoons overhead, whose rockets could destroy the heavier German armor. The Sherman's radio network allowed real-time coordination between tank units and ground troops, something German formations often lacked due to limited radio distribution. Its relatively light weight gave it strategic mobility. Bridges that collapsed under a Tiger could easily carry a Sherman. It could climb slopes that heavier armor couldn't. It was a tank that reached the battlefield faster, stayed longer, and could adapt to terrain rather than dominate it. The result was a fluid form of warfare, less dramatic than German offensives, but far more sustainable. The Sherman's value was not in its firepower, but in its presence. There were always more coming. The human angle, mechanics in the shadows behind every Sherman, was a man with dirty hands. The field mechanic, often unnamed, often unsung, was the nerve system of the American advance. In rain, sleet, or artillery fire, they worked in foxholes and roadside pits, replacing engines, welding armor, or rerouting fuel lines. Some units carried spare engines on trailers. Others cannibalized wrecked tanks to revive the living. Improvisation became a reflex. A broken drive sprocket might be replaced with one scavenged from an enemy vehicle. A fuel leak might be patched with a piece of ration tin. Many of these men had never imagined themselves as soldiers. They were former auto workers, farmhands, or factory machinists. But in the mud of France, they became as vital as any gunner or commander. They could bring a tank back to life. And sometimes, that meant saving dozens of infantrymen who relied on its firepower. These were the invisible warriors of mobility, fighting a mechanical battle few ever saw. And while they labored under the sound of thunder and shells, another kind of contest was unfolding, one between two opposing philosophies of war itself. Perfection versus persistence. Foi, the enemy's angle, the weight of over-engineering. To the German high command, war was an equation of superiority. Every tank had to be a fortress of steel, every gun a symbol of dominance. When the Tiger I entered service in 1942, it terrified Allied tankers. Its 80 mm gun could destroy a Sherman from over 2 kilometers away. Its frontal armor was nearly impenetrable. The Panther, introduced in 1943, combined that firepower with speed and sloped armor. But beneath their steel pride lay a fatal flaw: complexity. Each Tiger required more than 300,000 labor hours to produce. Its gearbox had over 1,500 moving parts. It needed special rail cars for transport and burned nearly 4 gallons of fuel per mile. Even the tracks were so heavy that crews carried a separate set for transport and swapped them before combat. When a Tiger broke down, and they often did, repairs could take weeks, not hours. Spare parts were scarce, maintenance crews overburdened, and the Reich's shrinking industrial base couldn't keep pace. By 1944, German divisions often fielded fewer than half their authorized number of tanks. Many were immobilized not by enemy fire, but by their own mechanical fragility. German officers mocked the Sherman's light armor, but as they retreated through France and Belgium, they began to see the truth. The Americans had built not a better tank, but a better system. The enemy's steel might have been stronger, but it was also heavier, weighed down by its own perfectionism. The laughter that began in 1942 was gone by 1944. What remained was disbelief. How could such crude machines be everywhere, all the time? 5. The moral and psychological angle, the spirit of motion in war. Machines mirror their makers. German engineering pursued precision at all costs. American design pursued practicality. One sought the flawless machine. The other sought the machine that could endure. That difference ran deeper than metal. It reflected the societies themselves. Germany's industrial structure was hierarchical, centralized, often bound by tradition and the authority of specialists. The United States, by contrast, thrived on improvisation. Soldiers were encouraged to adapt, to fix, to invent solutions on the fly. When rain flooded tank trenches, American crews built makeshift pumps from scrap piping. When spare parts ran short, they fabricated replacements with field welders. A U.S. Army report in late 1944 recorded that over 70% of tank losses in Europe were later repaired and returned to service. 80 feet C, testament to creativity under pressure. This culture of resilience forged morale unlike anything the Wehrmacht could match. American crews knew that if their tank went down, someone would come to fix it. German crews often knew that if theirs broke, it was gone for good. That difference in faith, in men, not just machines, changed how soldiers fought. The Sherman was not invincible, but it was reliable. And reliability builds confidence. Confidence builds momentum. And momentum, in the mud of Europe, was power. The Germans built tanks to dominate battlefields. The Americans built tanks to survive them. Winter in the Ardennes, December 16, 1944. Dawn. The forests of the Ardennes lay silent under a fresh layer of snow. Allied troops believed the war was nearing its end. The German army was shattered, retreating, cornered, or so they thought. Then came the roar. From the mist and frost of the trees, German artillery thundered. Thousands of shells crashed into American lines, lighting the forest in orange flame. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. It would become the largest and bloodiest battle fought by U.S. forces in World War II. Germans hurled their last armored divisions, including the fearsome Tigers and Panthers, into a desperate counteroffensive. Their goal: split the Allied front, seize Antwerp, and force a truce on Hitler's terms. At first, it worked. American units were overrun, roads were cut, and the cold turned everything into ice and chaos. The Ardennes in winter was no place for machines. The temperature dropped below freezing. Roads became rivers of slush by day and solid ice by night. Engines froze, fuel thickened, and treads shattered against rocks hidden beneath snow. For the German panzers, this was death by perfection. Their engines struggled to start in the cold. Their transmissions cracked under strain. Many tanks, short on fuel and spares, were abandoned before firing a shot. What was meant to be a thunderous armored assault soon turned into a graveyard of steel buried in snowdrifts. Yet the Shermans moved. Slowly, painfully, but they moved. American crews wrapped engines in blankets, lit fires beneath hulls, and used every trick of survival learned from months in France. Mechanics rode alongside the tank columns, carrying improvised tools, replacing frozen oil lines with cut, sections of hose scavenged from destroyed trucks. One U.S. tank battalion reported operating at 80% strength within 3 days of the German assault, not because they escaped damage, but because they repaired faster than they broke. The logistical arteries built in France now pulse toward the Ardennes. Convoys of fuel trucks, recovery vehicles, and supply trains pushed through bombed bridges and shell-torn roads. At the height of the storm, American tank retrievers, massive M32s and M31s, worked under enemy fire to pull disabled Shermans from snowbanks. Crews repaired them in the open, hands raw from the cold, using flashlights covered with rags to hide from Luftwaffe patrols. Every tank revived was another heartbeat for the defense. German officers later described their shock. They had expected the Americans to crumble in the cold. Instead, they watched a broken line bend, but never break, sustained by an invisible force of organization and will. As the battle dragged on, fuel shortages began to choke the German advance. Panzer columns stalled. Many tanks were blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. Meanwhile, the Shermans rolled forward again, pushing back through the wreckage of frozen Panthers. The simple tank, the coffin for 5 men, had outlasted the finest war machines of the Reich. And yet, the battle was far from over. The final blow would come in the new year, when the thaw came and the mud returned to test both man and machine once more. The mud fights back. By January 1945, the German offensive had lost its teeth. The skies cleared, and Allied aircraft returned. P-47 Thunderbolts diving on convoys, cutting supply routes, and leaving burning wrecks across the Ardennes. The snow began to thaw, turning the battlefield into a sea of mud once more. Thick, clinging, endless. What ice hadn't destroyed, mud now claimed. For both sides, movement became torture. Tanks sank up to their hulls, trucks spun helplessly, and soldiers trudged through filth that pulled at every step. But this time, the Americans were ready. The same lessons learned in Normandy and northern France now became their greatest advantage. Tank crews carried extra track grousers, metal cleats bolted onto the treads for traction. Mechanics pre-fitted them before dawn. Engineers built corduroy roads, layers of logs and planks laid over the bogs, so that Shermans could crawl where even infantry struggled. It was not glamorous. It was relentless. Photographs from that winter show Shermans crawling through mud like prehistoric beasts, exhaust smoke curling over white fields, crews shivering under blankets. In many units, tanks ran almost non-stop for days. When one bogged down, another towed it out. When one engine failed, its replacement came by nightfall. When bridges collapsed, pontoon units laid new crossings within hours. German Panther crews watched from the opposite ridges, their own machines stranded, engines overheated, fuel tanks empty, gearboxes locked. The Reich's armored elite had been reduced to spectators. In one engagement near Houffalize, a U.S. armored column pushed through 12 miles of frozen mud to flank the retreating Germans. Local villagers later described it as an earthquake of engines. Hundreds of Shermans grinding forward through terrain the Germans had declared impassable. When the two forces finally met, the result was decisive. Panthers bogged down, exposed, and immobile were struck from the flanks by coordinated artillery and airstrikes. Shermans swarmed the gaps, firing on the move, never halting long enough to become targets. That was the essence of American warfare. Motion. Even when the road turned to swamp, even when engines failed and tempers frayed, the system never stopped moving. By late January, the bulge was closing. The German dream of a counteroffensive died in the mud. Their tanks, the pride of their army, lay silent. Many without fuel, some without crews, all without hope. For the Americans, The cost was staggering. Thousands of lives, hundreds of tanks lost. Yet for every Sherman destroyed, two more took its place. The war machine of the United States had proven what its engineers always knew, that simplicity and supply could outfight perfection and pride. As Allied troops crossed into Germany in February 1945, they found roads littered with the remains of German armor. Panthers, Tigers, and half-tracks burned to cinders. In contrast, the Shermans kept rolling, their tracks worn thin, their paint faded, their crews exhausted, but moving still. The Germans had built weapons to dominate battlefields. The Americans had built a civilization that could sustain one. The mud had chosen its victor. The shock of endurance, spring, 1945. The snow had receded, leaving Europe covered in scars. Villages reduced to ash, forests littered with rusting machines, and roads lined with endless convoys of American vehicles pushing east toward victory. The German army, once the most feared war machine on earth, was collapsing. For many captured German officers, the end brought not only defeat, but confusion. They had spent years believing in their own superiority, in the craftsmanship of their Tigers, in the precision of their weapons, in the discipline of their soldiers. But now, as they sat in prison camps and interrogation rooms, they were confronted by an unsettling truth. The Americans had won not with brilliance, but with endurance. Interrogation records from 1945 capture their astonishment. General Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, reportedly admitted that he had underestimated American industry. Others, like General Hasso von Manteuffel, marveled at the Allied logistics system. A mechanical bloodstream, as one German officer called it, that never ran dry. They had laughed when they first saw the Sherman. Many described it as soft, unrefined, or unsuitable for serious battle. But their laughter had turned to disbelief when the same tanks reappeared again and again, repaired, refueled, reborn. German field reports from late 1944 often noted that destroyed Shermans reappeared within days, an observation that defied their understanding of warfare. Captured German engineers were equally astonished by the efficiency of American production. They studied captured maintenance manuals, replacement parts, and mobile repair depots with disbelief. The concept of interchangeability, every part fitting every tank, was alien to their war economy. Where German factories relied on skilled artisans to hand-fit components, American plants relied on precision machines to mass-produce identical parts by the millions. It was the difference between craftsmanship and manufacturing. And in total war, manufacturing always wins. To German officers accustomed to measuring worth by sophistication, the American approach seemed crude, almost vulgar. But they could not ignore the results. A Tiger tank might have required 10 days to restore to combat readiness. A Sherman could be repaired in 2, even in captivity. They spoke of it with a strange respect, a recognition that the Americans had achieved what the Germans never could. A perfectly balanced marriage of men, machines, and movement. In the months following the war, Allied intelligence units catalogued the statistics that explained the miracle. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States had produced nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks. Over 25,000 of them served in Europe. At any given moment, more than 70% of those tanks were operational. An astonishing figure given the terrain and intensity of combat. German production, meanwhile, had stagnated. Between constant Allied bombing, resource shortages, and technical overreach, only about 6,000 Panthers and 2,300 Tigers were ever built. Each was magnificent and utterly unsustainable. What stunned the Germans most wasn't that the Americans had won, but how they had won. By fighting a war that no single machine, however perfect, could hope to endure alone. The numbers behind victory. By the summer of 1945, as the guns finally fell silent across Europe, the full extent of America's industrial war power came into view. It was more than a victory. It was a revelation. Reports compiled by Allied Supreme Headquarters told a story that statistics alone could barely contain. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States had shipped more than 16 million tons of supplies to the European theater. Of that, a staggering portion had gone to fuel and maintain the vast fleets of vehicles that defined the Allied advance. For every front-line tank, there were 10 vehicles behind it: trucks, jeeps, repair carriers, cranes, bulldozers, and recovery tractors. The American war effort had become a moving continent of steel. In Normandy, there had been one vehicle for every 5 soldiers. By the end of the war in Germany, there was nearly one for every 2. That ratio was not an accident. It was design. Every Sherman tank that crossed Europe was part of a mathematical rhythm, a supply line stretching from Detroit assembly lines to Antwerp docks, to the mud of the Ardennes. The Red Ball Express had delivered more than 400,000 tons of fuel in just 3 months of operation. Thousands of mechanics kept the arteries clear. Thousands more rebuilt what broke. When historians later examined the data, they found something remarkable. Nearly 80% of tanks listed as destroyed in the European theater were eventually recovered, repaired, and returned to combat. No army in history had ever sustained its armor at that rate. This logistical supremacy transformed military thinking. For the first time, war planners understood that production and repair were not support roles. They were weapons. American generals came to regard logistics as the true measure of power. As General Omar Bradley later said, "Amateurs talk strategy. Professionals talk logistics." In contrast, the German economy had imploded under its own complexity. A Tiger II required over 300,000 man-hours to produce. A Sherman took less than 30,000. A Tiger burned 700 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. A Sherman, about 400. Germany simply couldn't keep its war machine alive long enough to matter. When Allied forces reached captured German depots, they found tanks without engines, assembly lines halted by lack of bearings, and crates of parts that fit only a single model. Precision had turned into paralysis. Meanwhile, American soldiers, young men who had grown up fixing cars and tractors, could strip and rebuild a Sherman in the field faster than most German workshops could process a repair request. It was the democratization of warfare. Engineering turned into muscle memory. By war's end, many of those mechanics and engineers returned home to build highways, machines, and industries that would define the post-war world. The same principles that kept Shermans rolling through Europe became the foundation for the modern American economy: efficiency, standardization, and mass production. The irony was profound. Germany had set out to prove that technical excellence was the path to supremacy. Instead, it was defeated by practicality, by an army that believed the best machine was the one that worked tomorrow. Across the ruins of Europe, the rusting hulks of Panthers and Tigers stood as monuments to overconfidence. Their once glorious armor now corroded, their guns silent, their engines long cold. But in countless towns and farmlands, Shermans still ran, as bulldozers, tractors, even museum pieces, reminders that true power lies not in perfection, but in persistence. The heartbeat of motion. When the last tanks stopped moving, Europe was quiet again. The smoke settled, the mud dried, and the soldiers who had driven, repaired, and rebuilt their way across a continent began the long road home. The Sherman tank, once mocked as crude and inferior, had done something far greater than outfight its enemies. It had proven that endurance is its own kind of brilliance. That simplicity, multiplied by will, can achieve what complexity cannot sustain. History often remembers the tiger and the panther as symbols of German engineering, powerful, majestic, unstoppable in theory. Yet their remains tell a different story. Machines that demanded perfection in a world that no longer allowed it. The Sherman, by contrast, embodied something human. It broke, it struggled, it adapted, and it came back. Its strength lay not in its armor or gun, but in the countless hands that kept it alive. The men who welded in the rain, who patched fuel lines with tin, who refused to let the wheels stop turning. In every age, technology mirrors its makers. The German tanks reflected precision. The American tanks reflected perseverance. One sought mastery, the other sought momentum. And when the mud came, as it always does, momentum won. From the factories of Detroit to the frozen roads of the Ardennes, the lesson remained the same. Greatness is not in never breaking down, but in never staying broken. That was the quiet truth of the Sherman, and of the men who drove it. A machine built not to be perfect, but to endure. And in that endurance, it carried the war and the world to victory.